Hi, my name is Jordan Kistler, and my paper today is entitled The Unstable Gothic Museum. In this paper, I want to consider the way Gothic texts of the 1890s responded to the role of national museums in public education. In the first half of the 19th century, institutions like the British Museum were considered to be public only in name. In the press, the British Museum was often grouped with private residences in complaints about extravagance in the expenditure of public funds, as in 1826 when a writer for the Bury and Norwich Post complained, "It is an unfortunate coincidence that the present period of national distress and declining revenue is one famous also for extravagance in great public buildings, or buildings for which the public pays greatly. At Windsor Castle, at Buckingham House, at York House, at the British Museum, and in Downing Street, expensive works are going on." Now, castles are public buildings, but not in the way we now imagine museums to be. But during this period, the British Museum was considered to be, quote, "a thing carried on for the sole advantage of the rich and the idle," in the words of the radical MP William Cobbett, exactly like royal residences. By the mid-century, however, public perception of museums had shifted. The press argued that, quote, "the end for which national institutions are created and maintained is to be a centre of universal education," and pressed for reform in the policies of the British Museum to make it more accessible and more legible to working-class visitors. In 1854, the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert, was founded expressly for this purpose. As arts curator J.C. Robinson said in an introductory address on the Science and Art Department at the South Kensington Museum, quote, "practical utility in an educational point of view is a museum's most important function." In contrast to the British Museum's exclusive, repellent atmosphere, which gave visitors the feeling of being admitted on sufferance, according to Robinson, South Kensington was to be fully accessible to all without distinction, so that it could serve its function of instruction to the unlearned. By the end of the 19th century, it was thus widely understood that this was the central function of public museums, and the reason why they were funded with public money. Museums were understood to be a complement to universal primary education, first enacted through the Elementary Education Act of 1870, allowing older children and adults to continue their education after the age of 12 in a form of self-instruction. Thus, the Museum of the Future, according to George Brown Goode of the Smithsonian, would be one of the principal agencies for the enlightenment of the people. And William Henry Flower, director of the Natural History Museum, wrote in 1895 that before long a well-arranged and well-labeled museum will be acknowledged as a necessity in any well-considered scheme of educational progress. This is the function of the public museum in much of the fiction of the age, including utopian fiction like William Morris's News from Nowhere, or science fiction like Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race. In contrast, Gothic texts of the late 19th century reveal anxieties about the construction of knowledge in monolithic institutions like the British Museum. In both H.G. Wells's The Time Machine of 1895 and Guy Boothby's Pharaoh the Egyptian of 1899, our heroes turn to museums for answers, and yet find none. In amongst the climactic events of Wells's The Time Machine, the visit to the Morlocks' underground lair, the death of Weena, and the final struggle for possession of the time machine, the time traveler visits the grand Palace of Green Porcelain. The text invokes readerly expectations of museums in the 1890s. The time traveler identifies the palace as a latter-day South Kensington, linking it explicitly with the South Kensington Museum's mission of instruction to the unlearned. When he steps inside, the collection he finds gives him hope that he will be able to, quote, "trace the patient readjustments by which the future world was developed," exactly as he would have been able to in the Victorian South Kensington Museum, whose collections were arranged into methodical series of specimens showing their historical or chronological and technical development, in Robinson's words. The text leads readers to expect that the time traveler will find vital information about the future within the palace. Instead, despite the palace's vast collection, which encompasses paleontology, mineralogy, natural history, mechanical design, technical chemistry, arms and armor, ethnography, archaeology, classical sculpture, and a model of a tin mine, the time traveler leaves the museum with no more understanding of the future or the mystery of the Eloi and the Morlocks than he had when he entered it. Rather than answers, he finds nothing more than a box of matches and some camphor. Similarly, in Boothby's Pharaoh the Egyptian, the hero of the novel, Cyril Forrester, visits a museum at a moment of crisis in the text. In this case, it is the fictional Egyptian Museum in London, clearly modelled on the British Museum. Cyril goes to speak to the director of the museum, quote, Sir George Lagrath, the most competent authority the world possesses at the present time on the subject of ancient Egypt. Yet, Cyril goes to Lagrath for a social introduction rather than his expertise in Egyptology. In Pharaohs, the museum is just one more exclusive club for the London elite, like the Royal Academy, the Antiquarian Club, and the numerous private parties and concerts that Cyril attends over the course of the novel. Lagrath is an old friend of Cyril's father, who's able to provide him with an address for the wealthy and mysterious pharaohs. So, what conclusions might we draw about these Gothicized museums, which hold no answers? The palace episode in The Time Machine, I argue, enacts a critique of the widespread belief in object lessons, which underpinned museum display strategies throughout the 19th century. As Good explained in 1888, our own proverb, to see is to know, expresses a growing tendency in the human mind. In this busy, critical, and skeptical age, each man is seeking to know all things, and life is too short for many words. The eye is used more and more, the ear less and less, and in the use of the eye, descriptive writing is set aside for pictures, and pictures, in their turn, are replaced by actual objects. Thus, the museum cultivates the power of observation, and the casual visitor even makes discoveries for himself. Yet, this is precisely what the time traveler fails to do. The only discoveries he makes are of objects with which he's already familiar. This is a museum built sometime in the far future, and yet everything the time traveler describes to us is from the Victorian era. Patrick Purinder argues that this suggests, quote, that the future civilizations intervening between our own time and 802-701 have scarcely developed at all beyond the technology and culture with which the time traveler was already familiar. In contrast, I think that it's simply that the time traveler can only describe what he can recognize. As Philip Fisher argues of museum display, to understand the work is to know the question to which it is the answer. The time traveler passes quickly over the huge bulks of big machines and a vast array of idols, objects that might be very different from the remains of his own age, because he has no way of understanding them. He cannot know the question to which they are the answer. The objects fail to speak for themselves, as they were intended to do in Victorian museums, and we can thus imagine that the time traveler's experience in the palace recreates that of some of the working class visitors to museums like the British Museum, where they might encounter a vast array of idols with little idea of where they came from or what they represented. It is absurd, as Paul Cantor and Peter Hoofnagel point out, for the time traveler to, quote, enter a world totally unfamiliar to him and yet believe that he can figure out by his own efforts exactly how it works. Yet this was precisely the belief that underpinned the government's approach to a do-it-yourself public education. The time traveler's encounter with the palace, therefore, reveals the illegibility of these exhibits to those excluded from their construction. The Egyptian Museum in Pharaoh the Egyptian equally draws readers' attention to who constructs the knowledge displayed in these public museums. The novel is deeply concerned with the truth of Egypt's history, yet it does not rely on the Egyptian Museum to reveal any of that truth. It reminds us that the knowledge displayed in London was collected, curated, and constructed by men like Lagrath and Cyril's father, white, British, upper-class gentlemen. We are told that Cyril has inherited his love for Egypt from his father, yet that manifests in the actual inheritance of Egyptian treasures, quaint images of the gods, and a mummy, which he uses to decorate his painting studio in the Egyptian fashion. The misuse of these artifacts is made clear early in the novel, when Cyril looks for the name of the man whose body he uses as decoration for the very first time, noting that, for some reason or another, I had never read the translation until tonight. Cyril does not view the mummy or the images of gods through a historical or religious lens. They are merely aesthetic objects. Now, we might see this as distinguishing Cyril from his father, the artist from the archaeologist, yet the text makes clear that the Egyptian Museum also fails to display the real truth of Egypt's past. This is because museums like the British Museum, on which this Egyptian museum is modelled, use the ancient remains of other cultures to construct a British national identity. As Sharon J. MacDonald argues, quote, "The possession of artifacts from other cultures was itself important, for such artifacts were, for colonialist nations, also a sign of the capacity to gather and master beyond national boundaries. As such, they were claims of the capacity to know and to govern." Thus, though ostensibly representative of Egypt's past, these objects actually serve to confirm the subjecthood of the white British middle and upper class male, at the expense of objectifying the colonial other. Egyptian artifacts particularly were displayed in ways that confirmed Britain as the inheritor of Western civilization, from the cradle of Christianity in Egypt through the Greco-Roman world and into the present day. The novel makes clear that these displays are not that different from Cyril's appropriation of artifacts as decor. Ferris, in his rage at the ravaging of his country, does not distinguish between the great museums and private collections. They are equally guilty and equally incorrect about Egypt and its past. It is Ferris, instead, who provides an accurate account of Egypt's past. Ferris, of course, turns out to be one and the same with Cyril's mummy. This is a Gothic novel, after all. Yet his ability to confirm the reality of Egyptian history stems both from his immortality and his race. As Elisa Bulfin asserts, quote, "Despite his proclaimed ancient origins, Ferris is insistently presented as one of and closely associated with modern Egyptians." This is in stark contrast to the British understanding of Egypt, which distinguished between its great past and its degraded present in order to tie ancient Egypt to 19th century Britain. The knowledge hoarded in the Egyptian Museum and private collections like Cyril's is worthless in this Gothic adventure. Unlike most 19th century Gothic novels, Ferris does not end with the triumph of the intrepid British heroes. Cyril's ignorance of the past and present atrocities Britain has committed brings vengeance upon the whole Western world. Needless to say, I refer to the outbreak of the plague among us, that terrible pestilence which swept Europe from end to end, depopulated its greatest cities, filled every burial place to overflowing, and caused such misery and desolation in all ranks of life as has never before been known among us. In one fell swoop, history as it was constructed in Victorian public museums, progressive, teleological, and centered on the British Empire, is swept away. Britain inherits nothing but the wrath of ancient Egypt and falls at its hands. This appears to be the same fate of the future in The Time Machine. The construction of knowledge in the Victorian Public Museum is at odds with the Gothic and decadent endings of these texts and their warnings delivered to their readers, and so it must be rejected, leaving both museums little more than eerie blanks within their texts. Thank you very much for listening.